1888 Toronto Orphanage, children played, but 36 years later. A the tale terrifies historians. The discovery, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had seen her share of disturbing historical documents during her 20-year career as a Victorian-era specialist at the University of Toronto. But nothing had prepared her for what she discovered in the dusty archives of the old Metropolitan Reference Library on a cold February morning in 2024. The Manila folder was unmarked, tucked between routine municipal records. From the inside, she found a collection of photographs that would soon send shockwaves through the historical community and beyond. The images depicted children at the Toronto Municipal Orphanage, circa 1888, children playing, laughing, seemingly enjoying their time at the institution. At first glance, the photographs appeared to be nothing more than charming glimpses into Victorian childhood. Children in period clothing gather around wooden toys, others playing what appeared to be ringed around the rosy in a courtyard, and groups huddled together reading books. The quality was remarkable for the era, suggesting they were taken by a skilled photographer with access to the latest equipment. "These are extraordinary," Dr. Mitchell murmured to herself, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined each photograph with a magnifying glass. The detail was stunning. She could make out individual facial expressions, the texture of the children's clothing, even the grain of the wooden floors. But as she studied the images more closely, something began to feel wrong. The children's smiles seemed too perfect, too uniform. Their clothing, while period-appropriate, appeared unusually pristine for orphans of that era. And there was something about their eyes, a hollow quality that seemed to contradict their apparent joy. Mitchell's assistant, James Chen, a graduate student specializing in photographic analysis, leaned over her shoulder. "Professor, look at this one," he said, pointing to a photograph of children playing with wooden blocks. "The shadows don't match the lighting, and see here," he indicated a corner of the image. "There's something that looks like it's been deliberately obscured." The professor felt a chill run down her spine. In her years of research, she had developed an instinct for when historical evidence didn't align with accepted narratives. These photographs were setting off every alarm bell in her academic mind. Like this video, if you're intrigued by historical mysteries and want to see more content about hidden stories from the past, she decided to dig deep. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage had operated from 1975 to 1925, housing hundreds of children over its 50-year existence. Official records painted a picture of a progressive institution for its time, with adequate food, education, and care for its charges. The orphanage had been praised in contemporary newspapers as a model facility, but Dr. Mitchell knew that official records often told only part of the story. She began cross-referencing the photographs with admission records, death certificates, and newspaper accounts from the period. What she found would keep her awake for weeks to come. The first discrepancy she noticed was in the number of children. The photographs showed approximately 30 children of various ages, but the admission records for 1988 indicated that the orphanage housed nearly twice that number. Where were the other children? As she delved deeper into the archives, Dr. Mitchell discovered that the photographer was one Edmund Blackwood, a man whose name appeared in several other contexts that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Blackwood had been commissioned by the city to document the orphanage's success stories for a promotional campaign aimed at attracting more funding and donations. But Blackwood's other work told a different story. She found records of him photographing crime scenes, including several involving missing children in the Toronto area. His name also appeared in connection with a secret effort of organization called the Society for Child Welfare, a group that, despite its benevolent name, seemed to have no official recognition or charitable status. The more she researched, the more questions arose. Why were these particular children chosen to be photographed? What happened to the children who weren't included? And most disturbing of all, Why did several of the children in the photographs match descriptions of missing children from police reports of the same period? Mitchell's hands trembled as she made copies of the photographs and began to compile her research. She had stumbled upon something that went far beyond a simple historical curiosity. These images might be evidence of something much darker, a systematic cover-up that had been hidden for over a century. As she prepared to leave the archives that evening, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of one photograph, partially obscured by what appeared to be deliberate damage to the image, she could make out what looked like restraints, metal shackles, that definitely didn't belong in a children's playroom. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage dark secret was about to be exposed. 126 years after it had been carefully buried, Edmund Blackwood's studio was located on King Street West, in what was then Toronto's bustling commercial district. Mitchell had managed to track down the building, now a trendy coffee shop, and convinced the current owners to let her examine the basement where Blackwood's darkroom had once operated. What she found there would add another layer of horror to her growing investigation. Hidden behind a false wall that had somehow survived multiple renovations, Dr. Mitchell and James discovered Blackwood's private archive. Hundreds of glass plate negatives were stored in wooden boxes, along with detailed journals documenting his work. But these were not sanitized promotional images that had been presented to Toronto City Council and wealthy donors. The hidden photographs told a completely different story. Images of malnourished children, some bearing visible injuries, filled box after box. Blackwood had documented everything. The overcrowded dormitories, where children slept three to a bed. The punishment rooms, where disobedient orphans were confined in darkness, and most disturbing of all, photographs of children who appeared to be sedated or unconscious. "My God," James whispered, as he carefully handled one of the glass plates. "This is systematic documentation of abuse." But it was Blackwood's journals that provided the most chilling insights. Written in meticulous handwriting, they revealed a man who had initially been hired to create propaganda for the orphanage, but had gradually become complicit in something far more sinister. March Director Harrington has requested another set of happy children photographs for the spring fundraising campaign. I have selected the healthiest specimens and provided them with clean clothing and adequate food for 3 days prior to the session. The others remain in the lower dormitories as instructed. The lower dormitories, Dr. Mitchell had found no mention of these in any official records. According to the building plans she had examined, the orphanage was a 3-story structure with dormitories on the 2nd and 3rd floors. But Blackwood's journals repeatedly referenced children being kept in basement facilities. April 2nd, 1888, another entry revealed 3 more children have been transferred to the special program. Whitmore assures me this is for their own benefit, though I confess their condition upon return troubles me greatly. The director reminds me that my discretion is both valued and required. Dr. Whitmore. The name appeared frequently in Blackwood's letter entries, always in connection with what he termed the special program. Cross-referencing with medical records from the period, Dr. Mitchell discovered that Dr. Cornelius Whitmore had been a prominent physician who specialized in what was then called alienism, the study and treatment of mental illness. But Whitmore's credentials raised red flags. While he claimed to have studied in Europe, there was no record of his medical degree from any recognized institution. His name appeared in connection with several experimental treatments that would be considered barbaric by modern standards. Subscribe to our channel for more shocking historical discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. The most disturbing entries in Blackwood's journal came from the summer of 1888. June 1888. Dr. Whitmore's experiments have taken a troubling turn. The children selected for his program are returning in states of profound distress. Some appear to have no memory of their time in his care. Others speak of the dark room and the machine that makes the bad thoughts go away. I fear I have become complicit in something monstrous. Ilaw y Quart, Tetio 288, I can no longer remain silent. Today I witnessed Dr. Whitmore administering what he called corrective therapy to young Timothy Morrison, age 8. The child's screams will haunt me forever. I have decided to document everything should anyone ever seek the truth about this place. Relievers Act, 288. Director Harrington has discovered my secret photographs. He has made it clear that my continued employment, and indeed my continued health, depends upon my absolute discretion. I am trapped, but I will continue to document what I can. Someone must bear witness. The final entries in Blackwood's journal were increasingly erratic, suggesting a man on the edge of a completed breakdown. August 15, 1988. They are moving the special program to a new location. The basement rooms are being sealed. Whitmore speaks of fresh opportunities and expanded research. God help those children. August 20th. If anything happens to me, let this record stand as testimony to the horrors perpetrated in the name of charity and progress. The children deserve justice, even if it comes a century too late. The journal ended there. Mitchell's research revealed that Edmond Blackwood had died in September 1988, officially from pneumonia, though the circumstances of his death were suspicious. He had been found in his studio, and several witnesses reported that his darkroom had been ransacked. But Blackwood's hidden archive provided more than just documentation of abuse. Among his final photographs, Dr. Mitchell found images that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the horror. Pictures of construction work in the orphanage basement, showing the installation of what appeared to be soundproof rooms. Photographs of strange medical equipment being delivered under cover of darkness. And most chilling of all, images of children being led away from the orphanage in the middle of the night, their destination unknown. The promotional photographs that had been discovered in the municipal archives were indeed propaganda, carefully staged scenes designed to hide a nightmare that had been unfolding just floors below where the happy children played for the camera. As Mitchell carefully catalogued Blackwood's hidden evidence, she realized that she was looking at documentation of what might have been one of the earliest systematic programs of child experimentation in North American history. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage hadn't just been hiding abuse, it had been the site of something far more sinister. And according to Blackwood's final entries, when the program was discovered, it hadn't been shut down. It had simply been moved. The breakthrough came when Dr. Mitchell decided to cross-reference Blackwood's photographs with missing person reports from the Toronto Police Archives. What she discovered sent shockwaves through her research team and would eventually force authorities to reopen investigations that had been called for over a century. Of the 37 children visible in Blackwood's promotional photographs, 23 matched descriptions of children who had been reported missing in Toronto and surrounding. These were orphans who had been legally surrendered to the institution. They were children who had simply vanished from their families and communities. 8-year-old Mary Catherine O'Brien had disappeared while walking home from school in March. Her parents had searched frantically, and the police had conducted what was considered a thorough investigation for the time. Yet there she was in one of Blackwood's photographs, wearing the standard orphanage uniform and standing among a group of children who were supposedly playing happily in the courtyard. 10-year-old James Fletcher had vanished from his family's farm outside Toronto in April. His parents had assumed he had drowned in a nearby creek, though his body was never found. Blackwood's camera had captured him building wooden blocks, his distinctive red hair and freckled face clearly visible. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Children from working-class families, often immigrants with limited English and little political influence, had been systematically taken and somehow ended up at the Toronto Municipal Orphanage. But according to the official records, none of these children had ever been admitted to the institution. Dr. Mitchell's investigation revealed a sophisticated operation. The orphanage director, Harold Harrington, had connections throughout Toronto's social services network. He sat on the boards of several charitable organizations and had close relationships with local police officials. His wife, Margaret Harrington, was active in women's charitable societies and had access to detailed information about struggling families throughout the city. The couple had used their positions to identify vulnerable children whose disappearances might not be thoroughly investigated. Orphans and street children were easy targets, but they had also taken children from families who were unlikely to have the resources or social standing to demand extensive police attention. Leave a comment below if you think there are other historical cases like this that deserve investigation. James Chen had been working on digitally enhancing some of Blackwood's damaged photographs when he made a discovery that changed everything. Using modern software to analyze the images, he had been able to reveal details that had been obscured by age and deliberate damage. "Professor, you need to see this," he called R&D from his computer workstation. On the screen was an enhanced version of one of the basement photographs from Blackwood's hidden archive. The image showed a group of children in what appeared to be a medical examination room, but the enhancement had revealed something that made Dr. Mitchell's blood run cold. In the background of the photograph, barely visible in the original but clear in the enhanced version, was a chart on the wall. The chart contained names, ages, and what appeared to be medical notations. But more disturbing were the columns labeled subject number, treatment protocol, and disposition. The children weren't just being held at the orphanage, they were being systematically catalogued and processed like laboratory specimens. Further enhancement of other photographs revealed additional horrors. Images of children with shaved heads and visible injection sites. Photographs of what appeared to be primitive electroshock equipment, and most disturbing of all, pictures of children who appeared to be in various states of consciousness, some clearly unconscious or heavily sedated. Dr. Mitchell realized that Dr. Whitmore's special program had been far more extensive than even Blackwood's journals had suggested. The orphanage had been operating as a front for what could only be described as human experimentation on children. The research team began mapping the connections between the orphanage and other institutions of the era. They discovered that Whitmore had connections to several other facilities across Ontario and into the United States. Letters found in various archives suggested that he had been part of a network of physicians who were conducting what they called progressive research into child psychology and behavior modification. One letter, dated July 1888, and found in the archives of a defunct medical college in Buffalo, New York, was particularly revealing. "My dear Cornelius, your work in Toronto continues to yield fascinating results. The subjects you have provided have allowed us to advance our understanding of the malleable nature of the developing mind considerably. I trust you will be able to continue your research despite the recent complications with your photographer. As discussed, we are prepared to offer expanded facilities should you need to relocate your program." The letter was signed by Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a name that appeared in connection with several institutions across the Great Lakes region that had been involved in controversial medical research during the late 19th century. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Mitchell realized that the Toronto Municipal Orphanage had been just one node in a much larger network. Children were being systematically collected, experimented upon, and then either returned to circulation with no memory of their experiences, or simply populated. The disposition column, in the chart that James had named, contained codes that the research team was still working to decipher. But preliminary analyses suggested that many children had been transferred to other facilities, while others had been marked with codes that suggested far more sinister outcomes. The missing children of Toronto hadn't just been victims of individual predators or random violence. They had been caught up in a systematic program that treated them as expendable resources for medical experimentation. and the cheerful photographs that had been used to promote the orphanage had been created using some of these very same children as unwilling models. The most chilling realization was that this network appeared to have operated with the knowledge and cooperation of civic authorities. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage received city funding and regular inspections, yet somehow the basement facilities and the missing children had never been officially noticed or reported. Someone in a position of significant authority had been protecting this operation, and according to the documents Dr. Mitchell was uncovering, when Edmund Blackwood had threatened to expose the truth, that protection had extended to silencing him permanently. Dr. Lessing's investigation had attracted the attention of Detective Inspector Rebecca Torres of the Toronto Police Service Historical Crimes Unit. While the crimes were far beyond any statute of limitations, the discovery of potential evidence of systematic child abduction and murder from the Etiotocentes represented one of the most significant cold case developments in Canadian history. Working together, the academic and law enforcement teams began to map the full extent of what they were now calling the Orphanage Network. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Through careful analysis of shipping records, medical supply purchases and correspondence between various institutions, they discovered that the Toronto facility had been connected to at least 12 other locations across Ontario, New York State, and the Midwest. Children were being moved between these facilities like cargo, with detailed records kept per treatments and responses. The network had operated under the cover of legitimate charitable and medical institutions. The Society for Child Welfare that had employed Edmund Blackwood turned out to be a front organization with connections to several prominent Toronto families. The society's board included a judge, 2 city councilmen, a bank president, and the wife of a federal member of parliament. Detective Torres had access to police records that Dr. Mitchell couldn't obtain through academic channels. What she found in the files painted a picture of systematic corruption and cover-up that reached the highest levels of Toronto society. "Look at this," Detective Torres said, spreading a collection of police reports across the conference table in Dr. Mitchell's office. Between 1987 and 1990, there were 207 reports of missing children in Toronto and the surrounding area. Of those 89 cases were closed within a week, with notations like runaway, family dispute, resolved, or false report. The detective pointed to a pattern in the report. But here's what's interesting. The investigating officers on most of these cases were either Sergeant William Morrison or Constable Patrick O'Malley. Both men received commendations and promotions during this period, despite having the worst solve rates in the department for other types of crimes. Further investigation revealed that both Morrison and O'Malley had received substantial payments from the Society for Child Welfare, officially for consulting services related to child protection. In reality, they had been paid to ensure that missing children reports were quickly buried and that no serious investigations were conducted. The corruption extended beyond the police force. Dr. Mitchell discovered that the city's chief medical examiner, during this period, Augustus Pemberton, had seen death certificates for several children who appeared in Blackwood's photographs. According to these official documents, the children had died of various natural causes and had been buried in unmarked graves in the city's Potter's Field. But when Detective Torres arranged for ground-penetrating radar surveys of the burial sites, they found something shocking. The graves were empty. The children who had supposedly died and been buried had simply vanished without a trace. Share this video with others who are interested in historical mysteries. This story needs to be told. The research team's breakthrough came when James Chen discovered a hidden compartment in one of Blackwood's camera cases. Inside was a small leather journal that the photographer had apparently kept separate from his main records. This journal contained names, dates, and locations that provided the key to understanding the full scope of the network. Blackwood had been documenting not just what happened at the Toronto Orphanage, but the entire operation. He had recorded the arrival of children from other facilities, their transfer to different locations, and most importantly, the names and roles of everyone involved in the conspiracy. The journal revealed that the network had been operating since at least 385. The children were being used for various types of experimental research, including early attempts at psychological conditioning, primitive lobotomy procedures, and drug testing. Dr. Whitmore's role had been central to the operation, but he hadn't been working alone. The journal named 6 other physicians who had been involved in the research, along with detailed descriptions of their specialties and methods. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in early childhood development, who had been conducting experiments in sensory deprivation. Heinrich Müller, who had been testing various chemical compounds on children to study their effects on behavior and memory. Dr. James Blackthorne, who had been attempting to map the developing brain through crude surgical procedures. The most disturbing entries in Blackwood's secret journal dealt with what he called the disposal problem. As the experiments became more invasive and dangerous, increasing numbers of children were dying or being left in states that made their return to society impossible. The network had developed systematic methods for making these children disappear entirely. Some were transferred to remote facilities where they lived out their remaining years in isolation. Others were given new identities and placed with families who had been paid to ask no questions about their new children's obvious trauma and behavioral problems. And according to Blackwood's most cryptic entries, some children were simply eliminated when they became too much of a liability. The photographer's final entries revealed that he had been planning to expose the entire network when he died. He had prepared a comprehensive dossier of evidence and had been in contact with a journalist from the Toronto Globe who had been investigating rumors of missing children. But before he could deliver his evidence, both Blackwell and the journalist had died under suspicious circumstances. Detectivo Torres' investigation into the deaths revealed a pattern to convenient accidents and sudden illnesses that befallen anyone who had gotten too close to the truth about the orphanage network. A social worker who had asked too many questions about missing children had died in a house fire. A city inspector que fick had access to the orphanage basement facility had a fatal heart attack and broito. A former employee of the orphanage que fick had borkemo puchimte neighbors about strange sounds from the basement had been found drowned in Lake Ontario. Yener contabars tiem protected by a combination of corruption, intimidation, and when necessary murder, and when the operation had finally been threatened with exposure, the entire conspiracy had simply vanished. The facilities tal de supue y converted to andalto buffetus, de to prexuba en ardio de spades preciosos toleretos tosetes, o jar lobillo tapenset el carfil destroyed. Except to Edmund Blackwood's hidden archive, which had waited 36 years for someone to discover the truth. As Dr. Mitchell and Detective Torres compiled their evidence, they realized they were documenting one of the most systematic and extensive cases of child abuse and murder in North American history. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage had been just the tip of an iceberg that had involved hundreds of victims and dozens of perpetrators across multiple jurisdictions. The enlazando perpetrators across multiple jurisdictions. The cheerful photographs that had first caught Dr. Mitchell's attention had been created using children who were living in a nightmare that most people couldn't imagine. And the detail que terrified historian was just what had happened to those children, y con bofade subirande, todo sta compis histórica la massive conspiracy, siu en malvan relais empes, y que stifpa, entite con il media de response on varios puron tudo, todo is vasuan kerene, rather taco poroteron uncovering the truth. La research ultimo encontré serious obstacles tiam suggested legas of suggested legacy of the orphanage network of Sepluhadla extended far beyond the 19th century. The University of Toronto's administration suddenly expressed concerns about the sensational nature of Dr. Mitchell's research and suggested that she focus on more traditional historical topics. The Metropolitan Reference Library, where the original photographs must be discovered, announced the archives of the renovación within un tefene ketera. No traveling of all, several institutions that were connected to the orphanage network were still operating in various forms. The building that had housed Dr. Whitmore's private practice was now part of a respected medical complex. The former Society for Child Welfare had evolved into a modern charitable foundation with significant political connections, and some of the families whose ancestors had been involved in the conspiracy still held positions of influence in Toronto society. Detective Torres found herself facing pressure from within her own department to limit the scope of her investigation. It's ancient history, her supervisor told her. We have current cases that need attention. Don't waste department resources on point que puedes entrar go. Pero both Dr. Mitchell, Detective Torres, were determined to see their investigation through to its conclusion. They had uncovered evidence of crimes that demanded justice, even if that justice was only the historical record setting the truth straight about what had happened to hundreds of innocent children. They había visto no other shows is ticket pintiari to prima que yo amici tu fiar one apa que am del little children. Para me que just ken padur squapti. Toto do wabi kuma puni, tom titolo fantavodia di leses de gertoda. While digitally analyzing on pro Blackwood's group photographs, he notiso que to pueda isoma profonte, en perbanlo de sovante gete a segemanissina. Sayo fotografies adventura nata quantitaroto municipal orphanage, but at a different location entirely. The photographs adon prin la badon de Toronto Municipal Orphanage, but at a different location entirely. Cross-referencing the street name with historical maps, determinata promotional photographed, había estabada haftinte steps at a provided resident in one of Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods. De su revalafton, tiente que en privada, is el big in front of ended Red Sea, to stenteneva such cause, de con brevely drove let see, to con brabausi ken. If these children weren't resident of the orphanage, where had they come from? Then where had they gone after the photograph todos were del Tisonda? Further investigation revealed that the resident belonged to Margaret Harrington, the orphanage director's wife. But the property record showed something interesting. The house had been purchased in 1887 with funds from an anonymous donor, and it had been specifically modified with basement facilities that matched the descriptions in Blackwood's journals. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage had been a front. The real operations of the network had been conducted at private facilities that were completely outside any official oversight or regulation. The children in the promotional photographs had been brought from these hidden locations to create the illusion of a successful charitable institution. Dr. Mitchell's team began mapping all of the properties the child had connected to the network's key players. What they found was a series of private residences, rural estates, and commercial buildings that had been modified to serve as secret facilities. The network had been far more sophisticated and extensive than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough in understanding the network's operation came when Detective Torres located the descendants of one of the police officers who had been involved in the cover-up. Constable Patrick O'Malley's great-grandson, Michael O'Malley, was a retired police officer himself who had always wondered about his ancestors' sudden wealth and mysterious career advancement. My great-grandfather left behind some papers that never made sense to my family, Michael told Detective Torres. He kept detailed record as payments he received, pero cuantaito te jolamon, dijo, de modos trovati contas allí, y lo homoafa de mis padawaltiplasio de win. It appears that Michael O'Malley provided with the missing piece of the puzzle. They contain detailed record as payments made to police officers, city officials, and medical examiners for their cooperation in covering up the network's activities. But more importantly, encontré addresses and code names for all of the network's facilities. Única mada, el de lo de estaban amolabore con una nat complete structure in of the conspiracy. Tirestamen e complete dierto por cubom rastabi con legititin tomadon por jitin. Because they in condition of upomenam gonnen of the spilis and morda, the recordos como vianir, to the avoid of many of the missing children, some mirrors the missing children. Some truajos taran transfers the two facilities in other cities when the Toronto operation became too risky. Others had been tidimantlab, como families prichos de piosienen, el reis mosidin turul claniach. Some records here na yigitid ruin, como some pavariodos have been partied into occasions for much of firaldo, to bridiusk, to mofas wite dialdisum documentero. So much dibi powder forma, to reading a second body you appears more fancy copyment of car preaches a miller dos cable. Says for the children, había tase de sodamashid was the experimentes que per me sagbe te recoteo podo tentros crescendalles. Tostegelisarpererom tetestrofaten coco vacation tra. Detective Torres arranged for archaeological surveys of the rural property that had been identified as the final destination for these children. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple burial sites containing the remains of dozens of children, all dating to the late 1880s. The discovery of the mass graves finally provided the physical evidence that proved the scope of the network's crimes. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed evidence of medical procedures, malnutrition, in many cases violent deaths. These children hadn't died from natural causes or accidents. These had been murdered when they were no longer useful for experimentation. As the full extent of the conspiracy became clear, Dr. Mitchell realizada el detalle que hallar inicialo contra para atención, the two perfect smiles and hollow eyes of the children in the promotional photographs have condemned evidence of something far more sinister than she had imagined. Those children have gone drugged, coached, and threatened to perform happiness for the camera while their fellow victims suffered and died in basement laboratories. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage scandal wasn't just a historical curiosity or an example of Victorian-era institutional abuse. It was evidence of a systematic program of child trafficking, experimentation, and murder that cooperated with the full knowledge and cooperation of civic authorities. And the most terrifying aspect of the entire conspiracy was how successfully it had been covered up. For 36 years, da que tencarían institutional inercia, familiar loyalties, and the simple passages of time. And Dr. Mitchell had stumbled across those photographs in an unmarked folder, da que tencanían etido l'agonia marito ferisundam sariki. Da que tencanían ton tropes o taujopuis, von agam polmidon tabiornagam de pueblos en fangenbenfero. As Dr. Mitchell's investigation gained international attention, researchers from around the world began coming forward with similar discoveries. The Toronto Orphanage Network, it turned out, had not been an isolated incidento para pene masista pad un debitucional child abuse taking pirital prekier, another presidente parliutines judana prieto del top prieter, winto trodo distonapia den pis de padin top prieter. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a historian from Columbia University, contacted Dr. Mitchell with evidence of similar operations in New York City. The network had been international in scope, cuando children being transported across national borders for various experimental programs. Cuando you've uncovered in Toronto is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Dr. Vasquez explained during a video conference with Dr. Mitchell's team. We've been tracking similar operations across at least 6 countries. The same names keep appearing, the same methods, the same systematic approach to acquiring and disposing of children. The international connections explained how the Toronto network had been able to operate so successfully for so long. To pressure mounted in one location, the operation simply shifted to another jurisdiction. Desnudo jageteiner in damages, y el miges minun zivlosen comeiste disappearance potibuele, duri de tapuerde sava socorro. Barabijomas disturbem discovery comen cames chen began analyzing of financial records que preserved in various archives. Waterfarn's network hadn't just been a criminal conspiracy, it has been a profitable business enterprise. The experiments being conducted on the children have been funded by pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, and wealthy individuals who were interested in the results of the research. Children were being bought and sold like laboratory animals when detailed records kept of their market value based on age, health, and previous experimental historia. Look at this, Jamin Sam, pointing to a ledger that banned on Toronto Bank. They were charging different rates for different types of children. Healthy children between ages 6 and 10 commanded the highest prices. Children cuya oriábateme subjete previos experimentos were sold at a discount, tomocata por pequeños count, tomellas de pie donde homologios conoste existí. Ter aviaven au barste can le domtretan forsete. Doste festier de busy company obscura, yo tirote con madirta. Mitchell's team also discovered the sum of the research in conducted children eventually been incorporated into legitimate medical and psychological practices. Techniques para boya via modification, tejaboya via modification, tejaboya via modification, tejaboya via modification, techniques para boya via modification, y con mental health treatment. Some of the pharmaceutical testing tejaboya via modification y hostrankum craven y tembegemetry children y contributed to the development of drugs that were still in use. The network's legacy extended far beyond the immediate victims. The knowledge gained through the suffering had been sanitized and incorporated into the foundations of modern medicine and psychology, como no acknowledged na mula parito. Detective Torres' investigation had also revealed troubling connections to the present day. Severo da archivaret fundaciones a medical institutos, de que s'ha grown out on tolo stitodo, stito que no pare quanto medical stitodo, yo ha prosecute anyone for crimes that happened 36 years ago. Detective Torres explained to a gathering of journalists and child welfare advocates, but we can examine whether any of these institutions are still operating in ways that put children at risk. We can make sure the system is la parelas a todo fambo, excluding beneficis e canabia timboria de fin forma. De sufenza al solien, desvaniga propoitas que son les exilieto doju, children who disappeared from the foster care system, runaways who were never seriously searched for, and institutional abuse that was handled internally rather than reported to authorities. The same vulnerabilities that had enabled the orphanage network still existed in modern child welfare systems. Dr. Mitchell found herself testifying before parliamentary committees and speaking at international conferences about the need for better oversight of institutions that work with children. The Toronto Orphanage case had become a cautionary tale about what could happen when charitable organizations operated without transparency and accountability. Pero pertente confada lo perdean. Pero pertenco plus abigontzai. And none chapter are net brought to the stories of the victims themselves. For the 106 years, the children who had suffered and died in the network's facilities had been forgotten, their names erased from official records, their fates unknown to their families. Working with genealogists and DNA specialists, Dr. Mitchell's team began the painstaking process of identifying as many victims as possible to create the memorial website where descendants of missing children could submit information and potentially learn the fate of their ancestors. They worked with indigenous communities to identify children who had been taken from their families and communities. They collaborated beyond the migrant historical societies to trace children para que ellos sorry to hear y care de ferlen is to show the mother poblado. Catulek dias era families everywhere pod, is to show the families pod. Todo etin era ancestor and durado ancestor, so etin et doretando soba, do soba do dintos syllables. Joseph Suroboth, titu therein Joseph Larven, mentu therenquis. For these families, doctoren who had been taken by the authorities, or who had disappeared into the system and never been seen again. For these families, doctoren who had been taken by the authorities, or who had disappeared into the system and never been seen again. For these families, doctoren who had been taken by the authorities, or who had disappeared into the system and never been seen again. For these families, doctoren who had been taken by the authorities, or who had disappeared into the system and never been seen again. For these families, doctoren who had been taken by the authorities, or who had disappeared into the system and never been seen again. For Mitchell's investigatiu provandias compre de chasquarea sin radondacia. Pero etinopif de la bibitau facil investigan como faming horizonte in l'estim bin nomares. The detail ya comantino per comanti che fosecne am morimurogant. Choivo morge de more per kixtix mad ritalintitos onge de boss. Pero sab de siutero fonam por intau fedimus situare de fonei. Veriadecto de habías fida, y capacite pero sira viejada, y capitante priativa fanda y su abdenciones betumat todo puedet. Nas Dr. Mitchell ofonded y saque de lictores about the case. The most frightening thing about the Toronto Orphanage Network wasn't that it happened 36 years ago, it's that it could happen again if we don't remain vigilant about protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. The final chapter in the Toronto Orphanage investigation began with the ceremony that would have been unimaginable when Dr. Mitchell first discovered those photographs in the dusty archives. On a crisp October morning in 2020, nearly 200 people gathered at Mount Pleasant Cemetery for the dedication of a memorial to the victims of the Orphanage Network. The memorial, funded by donations from around the world, consisted of a black granite wall inscribed with the names of every child who had been identified as a victim of the network. For many of the names, it enough de apelaban te con otros tabos to testificado by chantius. Tesus penultabos tabos te que aplavoje chão frazo de warafente de ciento, os comparananilles por naufo. Dr. Browblin Monrin, mongastes of the vincular republicly munte gende fenos fithaven a pro pins, o ma planoferenis. Gesonarottekels en de santengemors githos ganalbekten konfaring nonfu. Dr. Ramel Banotobel de Boldio do Frobale da lo Maitrabaus. Yo som for refuben if idigotev, bid komal battle sesta. Dr. Mamel doplod of tekker lautoschafel. Je kon er das afelseri na din command upload. Dr. Mamel doplod of teki command upload of Frobale no size of flofam. Bidi kepla vis tokum to says te tetterom de los plexterom in kiperasais. Dr. Mamel doplod of piros kesen of flof robales. Yukos of Psaborobel Furnanigan pies of Plofam, Psaborobel. Mitchell stood before the gathering, holding a folder containing the original photographs que te started investigation. These children were not just statistics or historical curiosities in fel, te course cheriol golia krijfen, te course carriol na crowd. The nekevers, with names, families, hopes, and dreams, they deserve better from the society that was. The investigation ultimately fight 34,40,000 timoftres. Typiker bien victor vioentele que nipter ben victor bien neuroparians, Wilnaporians, do pikin victor bien ipeciendo 92 yokak, pofuro pareor había fienden bigot south down ruete, increasing scrutiny from fair-minded journalists of social workers. Of these, 899 to Bahrain confirmed dead through the discovery of remains at various sites. The fate of the others remained unknown, though many had likely been transferred to other facilities or given new identities. The legal implications of the investigation are complex. While no criminal charges could be filed due to the passage of time, several civil lawsuits had been initiated by descendants of victims seeking acknowledgement and compensation for institutions that profited for the network. The Canadian government had established a victim compensation fund, and several of the charitable foundations with connections to the original network had made substantial donations to child welfare organizations. More importantly, the investigation had led to significant reforms in how historical institutions were regulated and monitored. New laws require greater transparency in the operations por organización. Estos afán de banda folla fanta parden tu a el ganampos en zaudargo, unicantaban febo jumaparico puede site distitural baus, quemaro bigambate ancrifertenso. Detectivo Torres had been promoted to head a new unit within the Toronto Police Service dedicated to investigating historical crimes and cold cases involving children. The Toronto Orphanage case showed us that just because something happened a long time ago doesn't mean it's not worth investigating, she explained to reporters. These children deserved justice then, and they deserve justice now. Researchers in the United States, Britain, Australia, and several European nations had begun examining their own historical records for evidence of similar networks. The Toronto case had become a template for how to investigate systematic historical abuse and had inspired a new field of study that combined traditional historical research with modern forensic techniques. Hams Chen had completed his graduate degree and was now working full-time on what had become known as the Historical Justice Project. Using advanced digital analysis techniques, he was helping researchers around the world examine historical photographs and documents for evidence of hidden crimes. Technology gives us the ability to see things that previous generations of historians missed, he explained. We have a responsibility to use these tools to uncover the truth about the past. For Dr. Mitchell, the investigation había nabo de promostri rewarding and post-traumatic work of her career. She received NAPRO awards for her research, including recognition from the Canadian Historical Association and the International Association of Historians. But she was most proud of the memorial wall and the knowledge that the victims of the orphanage network would finally be remembered. History isn't just about dates and events, she reflected during her final interview about the case. Isabados pidas es probado ni por mountes chukado yo, o dos pidel me darlemos chukabao. Bovuntigrmo es chukados il no photographs di amdo. De tamla starais je de siglifasti me ba ador ne besitje op madum Donaldflito, I gefia fasi Fabiersid, fenormando dorcast a special climate-controlled archive at the University of Toronto, where they served as both historical evidence and a reminder of the importance of questioning official narratives. Students studying the case were required to examine not just codo forobrigo, pon predo forobricuro, en lomana cidiado tobaterei. The detail que had initially caught Dr. Mitchell's attention, the hollow eyes and forced smiles of children who were supposed to be happy, had become a symbol of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when examining historical evidence. don't contour piente you don't forfeit appearances when examining historical evidence. Therefore, don't come as a tempo favelamity pochen, todo pipo desjofande, al fósito pontesendo pipo dend, do que siempre fan priinstumas extinctiona. Para que pues dejemos to important legacy de investigaciones cuando adheron asistoda la faniu y lo bonderives y toda es chulrijaos que tot saciati había muy bodo mimo sin falle. Que mobran a tu con el machos mercane, induce lo guad de noto per comachade. De memoria al ceremony conclude el yalino por reme. Todos dicen enyo fipetin por samautione, no por todo tille de bon. Otis perinem loita fiero disiperian O'Brien. Us disipirinem loitafien O'Brien, us disipirinem loitia de dispirhan of dispute. Her great-great-granddaughter, now a social worker specializing in child protection, had written, "You were not forgotten, though they tried to erase your names. You were not worthless, though they treated you as such. You were children, deserving of love and protection. Toyes we remember, toyes we sadris a publicidna diotolion gutoyo, ovvio soy obtubefifen, a siempre fifen taika." Sesquare to disperse then the flowers were placed at the base of the memorial wall. Dr. Mitchell remained behind for a few moments, studying the names carved into the black granite. Each name represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future stolen. The Toronto Municipal Orphanage case had shown that no matter how carefully crimes are hidden, no matter how powerful the people involved in covering them up, evidence has a way of surviving. And poster evidence is finally discovered by people with the courage and determination to pursue the truth. Justice, even delayed by more than a century, can still be served. The children in those promotional photographs had finally received the justice they deserved. Their hollow eyes and forced smiles hade quenen bond, poder omenro cavadas tidu, deben aferan förstukinors de que explotis metino suzon. En roquanda bodio mariomero entregar a micho obsidiadoma. Ten de barriofar, de pretecto bertunus todo muere rome. In the end, the detail that Terama's historians have become the key to uncovering some of the most important historical justice cases of the modern era, and the kilver of Teofanima de Comprodia Morquistopin 26 Yarais, finale cada es por Dulce das Aguas. Thank you for watching this investigation into one of history's most shocking cover-ups. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story to help ensure that these children's stories are never forgotten. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case, and let us know if you'd like to see more historical justice investigations like this one. Siendo Josué ya viejo, entrado en años, Dios le dijo,